The world yearned for harmony after the end of World War I. That war, optimistically called the War to End All Wars, had inflicted over 37 million casualties and more than 8.5 million deaths between 1914 and 1918. Yet in spite of the international hunger for peace, ominous signs of renewed world conflict began to appear within the next 15 years. And a major center of this gathering storm was Imperial Japan. A proud island nation, Japan was highly industrialized, but lacked natural resources. It was also feeling the effects of the Great Depression that hit the United States beginning in 1929, and was having difficulty maintaining its recently achieved world power status. By the 1930s, Japan felt compelled to use its military might to expand into surrounding territories. Such expansion would allow it to acquire raw materials and new markets, and to establish itself as the dominant power in Asia. In September 1931, Japan invaded and conquered Manchuria. Encouraged by this easy victory, the Japanese continued their Asian expansion plan by conducting a brutal invasion of China in July 1937, driving the Chinese government away from the coast and into the mountains. As a result, the U.S. was determined to take a stronger approach to matters of foreign policy regarding Japan. Storm clouds were forming in Europe, too. In the 1930s, two European dictators were making their own plans for world domination. In Italy, Benito Mussolini and his fascist party were vowing to regain the worldwide prestige and power Italy had once enjoyed during the days of the Roman Empire. In Germany, Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party were beginning to rule their nation with an iron fist. By 1936, Hitler and Mussolini had signed an alliance, the Rome-Berlin Axis. The European storm gathered strength when Mussolini conquered a defenseless Ethiopia in 1938 as the first step of his intention to extend Italy's control into African territories. In the same year, Nazi Germany's occupation of Austria and parts of Czechoslovakia intensified the buildup of the storm. In September 1939, Hitler's armies stepped up their European aggression by invading Poland. In response, Britain and France declared war on Germany. World War II had begun. Germany steamrolled through Poland, the Scandinavian countries, Belgium, and France. In less than a year, Germany had conquered most of Europe, and Britain was under siege. The United States still officially maintained its neutrality.
This nation will remain a neutral nation, but I cannot ask that every American remain neutral in thought as well.
But it also carefully monitored these global hostilities. While staying out of these conflicts, America did begin supplying materials and moral support to surviving allies, Britain and Russia. And in May 1940, as a warning to Japan against additional Asian aggression, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt ordered the U.S. Navy's Pacific Fleet repositioned from California to Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. At the time of this relocation of its Pacific Fleet, the U.S. Navy as a whole was slightly larger than that of Japan's, but because of the growing war in Europe, the American Navy was divided between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. By the spring of 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy was more than twice the size of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. It possessed 10 aircraft carriers to the U.S.'s 3, and a total fleet size of 232 ships compared to the Pacific Fleet's 109. Japan further escalated world tensions in September 1940 by signing the Tripartite Pact with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. The Rome-Berlin Axis was now the Rome-Berlin-Tokyo Axis. Hitler was excited about the alliance with Japan, and promised to support the Japanese in the event of a war with the United States. By this time, Imperial Japan controlled Manchuria, large portions of China, Korea, Taiwan, then Formosa, Hunan, and the Marshall, Caroline, and Mariana Islands. Its expansion plan now focused on a southern resource area consisting of Southeast Asia and the South Pacific, whose natural resources were critical to Japan's vital industries and its war machine. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander of Japan's combined fleet, believed the first step in this southern expansion was to attack the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. With this fleet disabled, Japan could then conduct its southern operations without opposition. By the time the Pacific Fleet could be repaired, Japan would have met its objectives and would have had time to develop a protectorate or defense shield around these new territories. So in January 1941, Admiral Yamamoto was directed to begin planning an aerial assault on Pearl Harbor. He studied in detail Britain's recent successful torpedo plane attack of 3 Italian battleships in the shallow Mediterranean port of Taranto, Italy. Up until this attack, shallow harbors such as Pearl Harbor's 40-foot deep waters were considered safe from torpedoes. When launched from aircraft, torpedoes required 100 to 300 feet of water in which to rise to the surface and find their targets. In shallower water, they would simply become stuck in the sea floor. Based on the Taranto attack, Japanese engineers began developing special wooden fins for the torpedoes that enabled them to be effective in shallow waters. With this technical issue solved, Japan had confidence their attack could be successful. While their planning for Pearl Harbor was underway, the Japanese made their first move in the southern operation by invading Indochina in July 1941. This action, in conjunction with Japan's recent signing of the Tripartite Pact, prompted the United States to cut off all supplies of raw materials and petroleum to Japan and to freeze all Japanese government assets. This oil embargo had an immediate major economic impact because at the time, Japan imported nearly 80% of its petroleum from the United States. This U.S. retaliation simply strengthened Japan's resolve to move into the southern resource area, particularly the oil-rich Dutch East Indies. Japan sent envoys to Washington to attempt to negotiate a settlement between the two nations. They offered to withdraw from Indochina if the United States would resume oil shipments. However, they made it clear that they intended to pursue territories to the south and wanted a commitment from the United States not to interfere. The United States responded that under no conditions would it tolerate additional Japanese aggression. On November 26, 1941, although negotiations were still in progress, Admiral Yamamoto ordered Japan's Carrier Strike Force to begin its 12-day, 4,000-mile journey. Its course was through the North Pacific, plotted south of Alaska's Aleutian Islands, and onto Pearl Harbor from the north. It was winter, and no ship traffic was expected in these stormy, foggy, subarctic waters. In fact, as an example of the meticulous planning that went into this attack, Japan had sent an ocean liner on a visit to Hawaii along this same route several weeks earlier. The military scout aboard reported no ships in this remote stretch of the North Pacific. To support the Carrier Strike Force, Japan also launched a special attack force consisting of 27 modern attack submarines. These subs, arriving in advance of the carriers, were to conduct reconnaissance in the Pearl Harbor area, attack any ships trying to escape from Pearl Harbor during the strike, and protect the carriers from any counterattacks. 5 of these submarines were fitted with 2-man midget subs that were to probe Pearl Harbor and join in the impending attack. The Japanese carriers moved through the rough seas under blackout conditions and strict radio silence. If observed at any time before December 6, their orders were to turn around and return home. Japan's best pilots had been hand-picked for this mission, but because of the secrecy of the mission, with the exception of senior officers, neither the pilots nor the crews of the warships knew their final destination. On December 2nd, when it was decided that negotiations in Washington would not be productive, Admiral Yamamoto informed the strike force to proceed with the attack. Only then were the crews and pilots told that their mission was to strike Pearl Harbor. As the carrier strike force approached its target, the disposition of the Pacific Fleet within Pearl Harbor was assessed by Japanese scout planes. It became apparent there were no aircraft carriers in the harbor, but many battleships were anchored along Battleship Row. Perhaps most importantly, there were no alert conditions on the island. On December 5th, Admiral Yamamoto sent this final message, which was relayed to all members of the strike force. "The moment has arrived. The rise or fall of our empire is at stake. All men must give their utmost." With these words, he unleashed the full fury of the storm that was to engulf the United States and the entire Pacific region.